It's a real pleasure to be here, and just sticking my head around the corner during the last presentation, I realized I'm way out of my depth when it comes to maps and analysis and GIS. But I have spent the past years trying to do some geographic designing of our own and trying to envision the future that we would like to see for wild Florida. So I'm going to start off by asking for a quick show of hands or a round of applause for anyone who's been to Florida. Wow, okay, so that's almost everybody. Okay, then the next exercise will be, please close your eyes for just a few seconds and conjure up the image of wild Florida that first comes into your mind. So I'm guessing it wasn't this. Cowboys. Or the ranch lands that these cowboys protect that are part of 1/3 of the state of Florida, which is still agriculture. Or you might not have thought of black bears that rely on Florida forest ranging from Pensacola all the way around the Gulf Coast down to Naples. Or perhaps not an Apalachicola oysterman tonging for wild-caught oysters in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Maybe you thought of manatees, but did you know that we have the world's highest concentration of freshwater springs on which they depend? Or ancient longleaf pine forests in the Florida Panhandle, which are centerpiece to the largest connected ecosystem of longleaf pine remaining in the continent. Or a Seminole Indian staying connected to her native heritage in the Florida Everglades. Or a female Florida Panther pioneering new territory and giving new hope for her species in the northern Everglades. This is my Florida, and in a state that's better known for beaches and amusement parks and too often national tragedies, wild Florida is still there, but it's hidden in plain sight. It's unseen, overlooked, or forgotten by most of our state's 21 million residents and 125 million annual visitors. So my mission and the people I work with is to help change that. So my work as a photographer didn't really begin until college. I studied biology and anthropology and went on to study ecology and journalism and photojournalism in graduate school. And I had this amazing opportunity after a series of internships with the Smithsonian Institution to go to the Central African country of Gabon. So I headed off, hardly into graduate school at this point, and was able to embed with these international teams of scientists who were studying the biological diversity there. It was really kind of the opportunity of a lifetime. And my priority that I was given was to photograph and document all the species the scientists were studying and collecting. So I developed studio techniques with soft lighting and velvet backgrounds and worked closely to try to capture animals for the scientific record, but also do it as artistically as I could. During that process, I photographed 400 different species. Many of them had never been photographed alive before, and a few were new to science, like these tree frogs or this sand snake. Now, when they were harmless like this, I would handle them myself, but when they were like this tree viper, and I'm far away from any medical help, the herpetologist helped out. And I actually bought a 200 millimeter macro lens so I could be a little further away. Gabon and with the Smithsonian Project is also where I really got to work with camera traps for the first time. I convinced my bosses to let me build 4 different camera trap systems to help me show pictures of animals in ways we couldn't otherwise see them. And this is back in the days of slide film in 2001 when we're not getting any instant feedback. So like literally 3 months had gone by when I finally put this picture across my light table and literally jumped up and down on my bed with excitement that I wasn't going to get fired and their investment in the camera traps actually worked. But working in Gabon gave me tremendous appreciation for intact wilderness. The country was 80% forest covered, and also appreciation of the value that storytelling and photography could serve for conservation when combined with science. And it became the blueprint and kind of the template for my career from that point forward. And I had a really exciting opportunity again with a group called Save the Elephants and the Wild Foundation, working in Mali with an endangered population of desert elephants in the Sahel. And I think I was going about as far away from home as possible to find stories that hadn't been told in the Western media, and picking some real comfortable spots like this where it was 120 degrees in the shade. Got to work with the camera traps again, got to really start to appreciate the cultural connections to wildlife conservation, the way the Tuareg nomads and the elephants were shaped from that common desert landscape and depended on one another. In fact, the Tuaregs would wait until the elephants were starting their migration, somehow knowing that water and rain had begun in the distant grazing lands, and the Tuaregs would follow. During this time, I also reconnected with National Geographic explorer Michael Fay, who I had met and worked with in Gabon. I had a chance to go to Gabon 6 different times during that Smithsonian project, and Dr. Fay had just finished a project called the Mega Transect. If you haven't heard of it, it was a 2,000-mile expedition starting in the heart of Congo and trekking all the way to the Atlantic coast of Gabon through some of Africa's most pristine remaining rainforest. And in the wake of that project, they inspired the protection of 13 new national parks in that region. So kind of the gold standard for active land protection, conservation in modern time. And so he was working on a project called the Mega Flyover, terrible name, but basically doing aerial surveys of the African continent, looking at the human footprint. And I was able to show up with some aviation gas on a runway in Timbuktu and get in his airplane with him for a little bit and try to get aerial photographs to show these elephants in their context. I learned a lot from Mali, and one of the big lessons was the absolute importance of large interconnected landscapes for wildlife. This is the northernmost population of elephants in Africa, and they make the largest annual migration of 500 miles between Mali and Burkina Faso. So thinking about how you have to maintain these connections. But between 2001 and 2004, every time I got on an airplane and went to Africa and came back, part of Florida was looking like this. And we, if you don't know about Florida's demographics, we gain 1,000 people a day net in terms of people moving to the state. And at this time, it's translating to about 150,000 acres of rural and natural land lost to development every year. And so I started feeling a tug to focus on my native Florida because I feel like this story wasn't adequately being told. So I started with the logical place, cattle ranches, because this really to me is kind of that definition of an underappreciated landscape in Florida. Ranches themselves represent 1/6 of Florida's landmass, but virtually missing from Florida's identity and sustain a whole lot of biological diversity in this kind of subtropical setting. There's also a chance for me to reconnect with my own heritage because my family goes back in Florida 8 generations, and I still have a lot of cousins who are full-time ranchers, and we have some small legacy ranch property in our family. This is me and my granddad when I was a little boy, and then this is a picture of my great-grandfather in the summer of 1929, and he was actually starting his term as Florida's 25th governor. I never had a chance to meet him, but he was a 4th-generation Floridian, and the little boy on the horse was his son, Carlton Ward Jr., who I did meet because I saw him at the state fair and at various holidays. But it wasn't until I did a magazine and feature writing class for the University of Florida that I had an excuse to go spend a day with him. And it totally opened my eyes and allowed me to see the land somewhat through his eyes. He told me about, as a boy, how they would drive cattle on horseback, camping under the stars for 2 or 3 nights at a time without ever seeing a fence. And to think about the scope of change in one single person's lifetime. And to learn about his land conservation ethic. He would never describe himself as an environmentalist, but he believed in his views that the land belonged to God and he was just there to take care of it. His son, Doyle III, is there on the horse. And I had a lot of motivation to kind of share this lesser-known story from Florida and for all its consequences for Florida's land and wildlife protection. I learned so many different things. The fact that the Seminole tribe has a big legacy in ranching in our state. Going back to an early Creek chief called Cowkeeper, and still now they're one of the top 6 beef producers in the nation. I also spent time with these cowboys on a ranch called the Likes Ranch, and it's in the Everglades Watershed. And these guys are staying connected to their heritage, but these cowboys have become heroes to me because they're not the ones that sold out for the quick and easy development. They are committed to their way of life, and their presence on that landscape is functionally protecting places like this from development. So the more and more I traversed and visited these different ranches as I was working on this project, the more I discovered there were so many untold stories hiding in my own backyard, including the story of the Florida black bear. So here I was, an 8th generation Floridian with a master's degree in ecology, and I did not know we had black bears living on cattle ranches in Florida, and in fact, almost entirely dependent on private landscapes in certain regions. But I met a guy named Joe Guthrie who was putting GPS collars on these bears and doing that with Archibald Biological Station and the University of Kentucky and learning about the ways they moved across the landscape. This is a bear called M13 in 2006 on a cattle ranch in Florida. And a bear they captured later called M34 went on a remarkable journey. In the summer of, let's see if this thing works. Yeah. This is up here where he was collared. Down in the lower right corner is Lake Okeechobee. Upper left is Interstate 4, close to Orlando. In the summer of 2010, he walked 500 miles in 2 months. He went 105 miles from north to south, and he basically connected all the green dots on the map that are conservation properties. And the reason he was able to do that is because the intervening lands are still largely agricultural. Ranch lands, groves, other permeable landscapes that provide not just safe passage, but also habitat for wildlife. The sad part of the story is that you can see at the edge of Interstate 4, he kind of skirted along and seemingly could not find a way to cross. And I don't know if he could sense that the 500,000 acres of quality bear habitat of the Green Swamp was just a few miles on the other side of that road, but either way, 8 lanes of fast-moving traffic and concrete. He ended up coming all the way back down and dropping his collar not that far from where he was originally captured. This is, kind of the area where he turned around. This area between Tampa and Orlando is so rapidly sprawling with development. You can see here you have a lot of creative opportunities with your real estate selection. If you look close, some of the driveways face north and south, and some of the swimming pools have round hot tubs and some have square. But this is why the bear was able to travel so far. These are pictures of agricultural lands. This is some of the last bayhead forest on a cattle ranch in Highlands County. These are the headwaters to Fish Eating Creek, the last naturally flowing tributary to Lake Okeechobee in the Everglades. Groups like the Nature Conservancy and others have been active in trying to protect these landscapes. And even the orange groves, you don't think of it as primary wildlife habitat, but it's secure and safe passage, and bears and panthers and other animals use these. A huge motivation for me came in the year 2006. And this is where I started to dabble with maps in my very amateurish way. But this is a population projection by a group called the 1,000 Friends of Florida, working with the University of Florida and the Florida Department of Agriculture. They're projecting Florida's predicted doubling in population by the year 2060, the red showing the developed land in this picture. And you can see the consequences. And Florida being such a narrow peninsula, not more than hardly 100 miles wide, a few bad development decisions can kind of put the nail in the coffin for connectivity in certain areas. You look at the green in the top center, that's Ocala National Forest. That's nearly 400,000 acres of quality habitat. It in this scenario gets pretty much hemmed in by development on all sides. Everglades National Park on the southern tip of our state, 4 million acres of contiguous public land could become an island separated from the rest of the state and the rest of the continent. But it doesn't have to be that way. And scientists for decades have been talking about the importance of wildlife corridors, of connectivity. This is a map and a vision put out in 1994 by Reed Noss at the University of Central Florida. The problem is these ideas were not finding their way into the public conversation, not in the planning process. There was an article written in 2006 about a kind of a boondoggle of a highway called the Heartland Expressway that was going to be built right in the middle of our state, like a can opener for development. And the article talked about hurricane evacuation corridors, transportation corridors, economic development corridors, but no mention of wildlife corridors. So that's when I went in the internet and started searching around, and there's nothing. And so I reserved the domain name floridawildlifecorridor.com and was thinking, all right, next time this road comes, we're going to have something else organized as a counterpoint. But I started to connect with the scientists and people who were doing the bear work, and then a guy named Tom Hochter from the Center for Landscape Planning at the University of Florida, and working with the Conservation Trust of Florida. They had this thing called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, and I started asking about it, and he's talking about the Caloosahatchee Connector, option 1 and 2, the Fish Eating Creek to Ocala Ecological Greenway, a whole bunch of things that my mom is never going to be able to say back to me, or a newspaper editor is not going to be able to necessarily communicate in a simple way. So I raised my hand kind of naively in a bear workshop, and I'm like, can't we just string a bunch of these things together and call them Florida Wildlife Corridor so that people will know what we're talking about? And I had no idea what I was getting myself into with that question, but they all liked it. And so we started taking the underlying GIS data of the Ecological Greenways Wet Network and prioritizing what would be a peninsular wildlife corridor, and kind of distilled that down into this vision where we broke it into existing conservation lands and conservation opportunities. And then to try to make this idea a little more publicly accessible, we commissioned a painting, and then we decided to do a 100-day, 1,000-mile expedition to show that it was still connected. But here is the entirety of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, both protected and unprotected land. This represents 16 million acres, approximately half of the state of Florida. 9 million acres are protected. So the rest is what we call opportunity area. So here's the kind of evolution of the painting and that vision. And then I don't know what we were thinking, but I guess when you're 20-something or 30, this seems like a good idea. But we walked and paddled 1,000 miles to the Florida Peninsula to show that this sort of corridor was still possible. And then in 2015, we left out this side, so we did another expedition to try to bring more attention to different parts of the landscape. And so now I've had the opportunity to trek 2,000 miles through the wildest parts of Florida that are still left, and it's been a tremendous opportunity. We worked with so many different stakeholders. I mean, it wasn't just me proposing a map and putting it on Facebook. It was working with Defenders of Wildlife, Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Florida Wildlife Federation, the state agencies, and getting people together and talking about a shared vision and trying to get people behind it. So I'm going to kind of breeze through some expedition pictures. I'm not going to be able to let myself go too deep in sharing these stories, but this is myself and Joe Guthrie, the bear biologist you met. We went and we were push-pulling our kayaks, pretending to be gladesmen in the Shark River Slough. Really a magical experience in the beginning of the first expedition. This is Mallory Likes-Dimmitt. She did large landscape conservation planning for the Nature Conservancy in the Four Corners region in the west, but she's a multi-generation Floridian who wanted to really get involved at home. So we set off on this expedition, and the reason we started in the Everglades is kind of what I alluded to earlier in that map, the 4 million acres of contiguous land. And the Everglades arguably has the most at stake in this proposition of whether or not we save connectivity to the north, because we could lose the connection to the headwaters, and we could lose the lifeline for Everglades species like panthers, who are presently, for the most part, isolated there. We hiked under some wildlife underpasses, which was cool. This is under Interstate 75, and I'll come back to this a little bit later in the presentation. 51 days. That's how much time we spent hiking and paddling in the Everglades Watershed before ever setting foot out of it. People think of the Everglades, they think of that area down between Naples and Miami, but the watershed begins in present-day Disney World in the edge of Orlando. And we ended this expedition, we went from there to the St. Johns River, and then we ended paddling upstream on the Swanee River. And Mike Fay, the guy whose expedition make ours look like a walk in the park, he joined us for the final week of the 2012 expedition. And there were moments we were sitting around the campfire in the rain in the Okefenokee swamp and feeling like we're in a place that is almost as wild as Africa, but then also kind of realizing that this journey, this expedition is just beginning, because the goal is to really permanently protect and save that land for the corridor in Florida. So I've talked some about watersheds. I'm trying to put my amateurish version of some maps in here. But this is the Everglades Watershed. So when I mentioned how many days we spent traveling in that system. And the remaining corridor is probably because we've been a little better about setting aside wetlands than uplands. And if you look, this is the Everglades Watershed combined with the St. John's Watershed. So just two of the main watersheds in the Florida Peninsula, you're almost connecting the whole state. You add in the Suwannee Watershed, and these three watersheds are the basis for the corridor. It shows us how the land and water are inseparable, especially in a flat and rainy place like Florida. Not sure where this slide got in my talk at this point, but here's some more real estate options if you're really attracted to this kind of thing. Yeah, these are out of place. But I'll talk about this though. Not all roads have to be terrible. This road was built recently through a watershed, and they just built it like a bridge. And so it's a full mile span of elevated roadway through a creek in the northern Everglades. And in the dry season, animals can use it freely, and in the wet season, the water can move as it should. So I'm going to just talk about a couple landscapes before I kind of move into some of the Panthers. Again, this is another view of the Everglades, and the Nature Conservancy and other groups had a good concept where they started describing this area near Orlando as the Everglades headwaters. It helps connect it to the iconic conservation landscape that we have in our state. And just driving, coming into the airport here and driving down I-10, I'm like, holy crap, there's giant mountains everywhere. Like Florida has nothing. The highest topography is probably like Space Mountain at Disney World, but you have very subtle. The Everglades has a pitch of 1 inch per mile or a centimeter per kilometer, very gradual. And so the sense of headwaters is like, it's easy to think about when you think about the snow melt coming off the mountains and the streams coming, but it's harder to see here, and that's where the maps and the images come into play. But this is the northern Everglades, in a region of pine forest and cypress-lined lakes and the Kissimmee chain of lakes, and also ranching and rural landscapes. There's a lot of promise in a landscape, in a conservation project called the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge and Conservation Area. Under Ken Salazar, this was created and authorized for up to 50,000 acres of new National Wildlife Refuge, surrounded by 100,000 acres of associated conservation easement. But so far, we have 10 acres, because that's how the Nature Conservancy donated 10 acres of the 50,000 acre authorized refuge, and there's been no funding at the federal level to realize this vision since then. There's been some incremental progress with land trust and other state level acquisitions in the kind of easement area, but there's a long way to go there. But this is a cattle ranch that was ahead of the curve, and 90% of it is under easement, and it'll ensure that these low density ranches will never be replaced by intensive agriculture or subdivisions in this area. More on the Kissimmee River as it moves down towards Lake Okeechobee. So I'm going to skip ahead here to another region I want to share with you, which is an underappreciated part of Florida, and it's the longleaf pine forest. Longleaf pines, they once comprised 90 million acres of the southeastern United States, and it's down just to 3% of that today. Groups are working to try to restore longleaf, and it's a habitat type that's, at least on a plant diversity level, rivals tropical rainforest. You have 40 species per square meter in some of these areas, and iconic endangered species like the red-cockaded woodpecker that require 60 or 70-year-old pines to make their nest cavities. And so they're really in trouble, but biologists helped them along by building cavities in some of these trees that were not quite there yet, and they've actually been a great recovery story. Man in the blue shirt is E.O. Wilson from Harvard, and the man in the red shirt is the late M.C. Davis, who was a developer turned conservationist, largely inspired by Dr. Wilson's writings and books. Dr. Wilson's half-Earth idea, that the notion that if we want to have balance on this planet and save biodiversity, we need to set aside about half of it. Somewhat was inspired from the pine forest of the Florida Panhandle. I took this picture when I was photographing an article for Smithsonian about it a few years ago. But the vision for rewilding and restoring the longleaf pine forest to the southeast is a good testing grounds for the half-Earth idea. And M.C. Davis, he personally acquired 50,000 acres of defunct croplands and old timber clearcuts and assembled the largest private longleaf pine restoration that exists. And when the Department of Transportation came to him and said, we want to widen a highway that's going by your property, he said back to them, well, I'll do it if you'll build 3 highway underpasses at historic drainages that connect my property to the property next door. And good thing he did, because the property next door is the 450,000 acre Eglin Air Force Base, which has 500-year-old pine trees and is centerpiece to this hub of longleaf restoration and longleaf habitat. It ties into Blackwater River State Forest, 200,000 acres next to that, and then up into Conecuh National Forest in Alabama. So there's 1 million acres of longleaf in this section. And to be camped out here during our 2015 expedition and know that there's nothing but, or everything but pine forest for miles and miles in every direction was really an awesome thing. But these expeditions were the opportunity of a lifetime, and then also super frustrating as a photographer, because we only got to stay one night in each place, and we had to keep moving. And I wanted to go deeper and revisit in different light and try different perspectives. So that opportunity came to me later in 2015. Maybe the universe answered a little too strongly in this case, but I got an assignment from National Geographic Travel to look at 10 Florida parks in South Florida. One of them was Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. And not being a very good businessman and not very good at time management, I'm like, well, I'll get out one of my camera traps. I only have 1 day assignment, but I'll set it up, and then 2 months later I'll come check on it and see if I can get anything. And I wrote a blog about that experience, and it was called Cooperative Bear, Frustrating Panther. And this panther, I don't know if she has any idea on what she's done to my life for the past 3 years, because at this point I was hooked. I mean, this is a quintessential South Florida swamp landscape in the Fakahatchee Strand. It's the last big cat in the east, and I failed miserably in getting the picture I was looking for. And I also was pretty naive to the nature of these swamps, because had I checked my camera a little more regularly, like now we look at them every 2 weeks, and I would have seen the swamp water was rising and was going to drown out all my infrared triggers, and it really set me back. But instead, I doubled down my efforts, and I wrote to the National Geographic Society for a grant and started on the Path of the Panther project. And so I was based in Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge with some of the locals here for nearly 2 years, starting in 2016. And so the photographs from this point forward in the talk haven't been published, so if you don't mind not taking pictures or sharing any of them yet, that we're working towards trying to do something with National Geographic for those. So here I'd kind of reconnected with what might have been obvious, but the Florida Panther is, to me, the ultimate emblem of habitat connectivity and the Wildlife Corridor Project in Florida. It's our state animal. It's the last puma surviving in the eastern United States. Its breeding population is functionally isolated to the Everglades. A male panther has a home range of 200 square miles, so you can't really even protect a single individual without multiple properties anywhere other than a 1 million acre conservation land like Big Cypress. So I started out and had to the only way I was going to accomplish this was camera traps, because while numbers are up to approximately 200, that's spread over millions of acres, and they're nocturnal and extremely elusive. So I've been doing a lot of this over the past years. An animal like the Florida Panther is not going to walk 3 feet from my camera lens, no matter how long I wait there. But by setting a camera trap, placing my infrared beam at the right place, putting my strobe lights in the trees, and kitting a camera in a waterproof box that can endure the elements, I can help the panther take its own picture. So that video compresses a couple years and makes it look easy. But this is more what my experience looked like. This is one spot where, I forgot to mention where the water came up in that part of the Fakahatchee Strand. Then we had a wet winter, and it didn't go dry again for 18 months. So I wasn't able to try again. I moved the camera up to an old logging road that had some similar kind of habitat, and it's been there for 3 years. And I was getting pictures like this. And if my goal is to do comparative anatomy on bears and panthers, I was onto something. But at this point, a smarter photographer might have swung around to the other side of the branch. But I really liked the background with the palm tree on this one. And then I'm getting an amazing portfolio of bear pictures, and very cooperative bears and frustrating panthers. But I'm determined to try to capture the picture in this uniquely South Florida landscape, rather than trying to set it up on the dirt road that could be Texas or could be anywhere else. And so this time the bears kind of joined the Panthers team. Not so cooperative anymore. I think those cypress knees would make an equally good scratching post. I'm glad you like those flash wires so much. So this is what I arrived to, because I have to check the card to know of the video of what actually went down, but it became pretty obvious with this glimpse. And so finally I got what I would say is a good picture of a Florida panther. But the problem is it's not like the best ever exceptional picture of a Florida panther. And I spent 45 minutes on the phone with a colleague, Steve Winter, who's one of the world's leading big cat photographers for National Geographic. He did the Hollywood cougar picture and things like that. And he told me I was trying to do too much of my lighting, that I needed to actually pick one very specific place and light it. I have flashes in multiple spots, not knowing where the panther is going to be. And he said, you'll get a good picture, but not an exceptional picture. So I reworked the lighting. I used an intern from the University of Miami as a panther model, and got the lighting a lot more subtle, a lot more natural. I lowered the camera position so it'd be better with the panther's eye line. But then the panther never came. I had to learn my herpetology. This is called an amphiuma. It's a giant salamander that looks like a snake that this alligator I was like, what is in his mouth? And then the swamp otters came again. So my bycatch is looking pretty good at this point. I have my best ever bear pictures, best ever alligator pictures, and we have inches to spare separating the surface of this swamp from my camera and my flash equipment here. So, the swamps can be frustrating, but it's kind of the perfect antidote for my wanting to revisit the same place over and over again rather than camp in one spot a night, because I've been to some of these places once a month or more often for multiple years at this point. Here I was trying to get a panther walking in water. You can kind of see some of the behind the scenes of setting up a tripod, you get a dog leash anchor and you screw it into the ground, and then you strap your tripod to it so that an alligator or a drifting log doesn't knock everything in the water. So here, I got some really good bird photographs, and a few too many bird photographs because they false triggered the camera 4,000 times in 2 weeks, because I guess the water level hit just the right spot for perfect fishing for long-legged wading birds. But thankfully, I was able to reset the camera, and I did get finally getting somewhere, finally getting some pictures showing these animals as they haven't been seen before. And, a panther doesn't prefer a swamp. It was like a convenient myth that justified the development of all the wetlands in Florida. But their ability to persevere in the swamp is what has allowed them to exist in the eastern United States at all, because it was the last landscape where they weren't in direct competition for our needs, or what we thought were our needs. So here's another place where I really want. Whoops, there's a video in here. I thought maybe I can try to get a camera, when the water comes up, maybe I can get a panther. Okay, not playing. Here we go. I've been doing a lot more video now as well. I just have a few clips here I'm sharing. A cooperative bear returned, or a bear, and my goal is to try to get a panther coming towards the camera, moving over this log. And this is what I got in this situation. So a lot faster, a lot higher jumping than I anticipated. And then along came Hurricane Irma, so a Category 4 storm, making landfall about 20 miles away. And this is not supposed to be a video, or not supposed to be a time lapse. It's just what happens when the eye wall or something before that creates 3,000 false triggers on your camera system, so it kind of memorializes its own death. So if you remember that, I don't know if this one auto starts or not. If you remember the scene where we were hiking beneath the underpass, this is that same underpass. And when I revisit it from the perspective of this Panther project, I really wanted to put some energy into camera trapping here. So that bear has just come out of Picayune Strand State Forest and safely crossed into Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge beneath Interstate 75. And there are 30 wildlife crossings like that were built beneath Interstate 75 for the purpose of helping protect panthers and other wildlife. It's a combination of the underpass and the cross fencing that makes these things really work. And so another cooperative bear, early in the project, first 2 months trying, this happened, and maybe a more cooperative semi-trailer. And so here we had a slightly less cooperative Toyota Camry, or whatever that white car is that you can hardly see. So, but getting towards pictures that can help tell that story. And this is me trying to do something to add some maps to my presentation. But there is some there's some cool work happening. The Department of Transportation, in Florida, is taking seriously wildlife underpasses. They've created a GIS map that locates the different wildlife underpasses, and then different stakeholders, whether it's researchers or university people who have cameras monitoring these, they are supplying imagery to this site. And if I was better, I'll email Ryan the link to it if you guys want to check it out. And here you can zoom in higher detail and click on different layers, and you're looking at where the panther mortalities are in red versus the underpass locations and other things like that over many years. You can do certain parts where there aren't any underpasses. It's almost like a solid red line of how many panthers have died. Or no, I'm sorry, those red lines signify hotspots. But I did finally get a picture there that I, at least kind of made the mark with my editor. And I get some PTSD looking at this, because there are actually 14 camera flashes to light this scene. I have to light both spans of interstate, and changing out 100 antelope rechargeable batteries. It's just kind of a dark chapter. But these things work, and they help prevent this problem. I mean, Florida loses 30 panthers a year the past few years to vehicle strikes. And this is happening on the edge of Naples, where the development keeps pushing further and further into the Everglades. The Panther vet, Lara Kusek, said she started being a veterinarian to save animals, not process dead ones, but that becomes a reality of her work. But the biggest positive news, really in my Florida conservation career, but definitely within this project, happened in November of 2016. Biologists from our state conservation commission got this picture where it looks like a female panther, but they fortunately were checking the camera the day after she was there, and they were able to go find a fresh track, enough to really corroborate the data and show that this was definitely a female panther. And this is a female panther that had moved north of the known breeding range for the first time in nearly 50 years. So if we look at this map, the area in red was a known breeding range of the Florida Panther until now. And you can see that juxtaposed against the Florida Wildlife Corridor beyond. So I got to work with a scientist and put out camera traps of my own. And when I shared this picture, which I got in January of 2017 with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Panther coordinator, he said, I've been dreaming about her for 18 years, because all their efforts with the genetic recovery in the 90s and the habitat conservation has all been towards trying to get them out of that island of habitat and to reclaim territory elsewhere in the state. And she's kind of the bellwether and the hope for that. So I see that I've run up against my time. I have maybe 5 more minutes of slides. Is that okay to go through those? Okay, cool, thank you. So, the reason that female panther north of the river was a really big deal is males have been wandering the Florida Peninsula for decades now, because they have the larger home range. The number 2 cause of death on panthers beside roadkill is panthers killing panthers over territorial disputes. So if you're a young male, you have major pressure to move north. I mean, one was even shot by a hunter outside Georgia, or outside Atlanta, about 7 years ago, that was traced back to being born in the Everglades. So that in a sad way shows us that they can still find a way. And so getting these kind of pictures was starting to feel really exciting. So the Panther's doing its part. The conservationists have been doing their part, and now it's up to the rest of us, especially those of us in Florida, because are we going to continue to allow low-density sprawl to erode the habitat, to push further and further inland, and to basically block the progress that the panther is making? Places like this where we're squeezing the natural systems absolutely to the brink. Or are we going to invest in the large landscape conservation that can keep the 4 million acres of public land of the Everglades connected to the remaining 13 million acres of the Florida Wildlife Corridor beyond? Are we going to help 13th generation Floridians like rancher Elton Langford stay connected to his heritage by giving conservation alternatives to the otherwise predictable development? Or realize the promise of big opportunities like the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge and Conservation Area? Because the path of the panther is about all of these things. It's about the cypress trees where thousands of swallowtail kites gather on a Glades County ranch every year before they make their annual migration over the Gulf of Mexico, over the Andes, to the Pantanal of Brazil and back. Protecting the land for the panther ensures that those trees will still be there when they return. Trees that in forests that harbor thousands of other species, like this black bear on a Glades County ranch close to Big Cypress. Or where Morgan Yates, a native of the Panther clan, can stay connected to her Seminole heritage through the land she loves. After 3 years of working with camera traps deep in the Everglades, I have a renewed sense of hope that the story of the Florida Panther rising up out of the swamps can help inspire a public movement to save the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And ultimately, the panther can help us show wild Florida to the world in a way it will no longer be forgotten. So that's normally where I would end my talk. But the truth is, these pictures can get people motivated, but they're not going to lead to the change without cultivating a direction for that change. And that's where I think I see so much potential with using maps to contextualize these stories, and to, when people get fired up and want to do something, to show the blueprint for what we want to accomplish. I'm happy to have been working with Ryan to learn about some of the tools like green infrastructure, and we were able to use some of this data to look at similar projections for Florida to kind of show alternatives, which you can dig a little deeper in and see some of the consequences. And this is actually not quite as aggressive as the local predictions are, or somehow to take information like this and make it real and available to people, where you can see the intensity of the development that happens over a 20-year time span in some of these areas. Or help recognize that in a place like Florida, where we don't have mountain ranges and physical barriers and limits to our development, it's going to take intentional land protection in order to put those limits in place. Here, where we have Everglades National Park, you can see the 20-year time lapse of development on Miami, where it doesn't really expand out. It goes inward and upward, like what we need to be doing everywhere. But over on the West Coast, where I'm from, inland to Bradenton, where you don't have those public lands as barriers, or you can see how far the sprawl moves. And it doesn't take long in places like this, in a state that's only 100 miles wide, till you're doing irreversible harm in places. Areas in Central Florida. But I kind of just stumbled across something that was actually kind of hopeful coming out of Ocala National Forest during that same 20-year time span. I think they actually had some planning in place. And you can see a narrow wildlife corridor emerges around a kind of I think it was probably designed for a bike path or something, but it works. So I'm going to click through those, and then I've begun so this is kind of there's so much information out there, and it's not like assembled in a cohesive kind of atlas or something we could, I'll end with my wish list of what we could maybe somehow come up to create. But I'll give a little bit of a preview of what I'm working with Alan Carroll in the Arlington office to try to do a story map about the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is an exciting opportunity, taking some of this data and bringing it into in ways that we'll be able to make this in context with the narrative. And kind of fresh views and interpretations of some of these maps, bringing in things like sea level rise, being able to come into species by species level and tell some stories about existing bear habitat and the movement of individual bears across some of these landscapes. So this is all just the preliminary work we've been doing. But my ultimate wish with all this is if we could have some kind of, this is going to probably sound rudimentary stuff that you're like, oh yeah, so-and-so does that in like 2 days. But if we could have a living, breathing atlas of conservation lands in Florida, where you could take this 17 million acres of the corridor and almost like it's probably a bad analogy, but take like a CNN election map, where you can show every time a parcel gets conserved or every time you lose a parcel. You could take it at the state level, or you could drill down to the county level or the individual parcel level. And if you had a common framework, then the individual land trust and conservation groups could report on the successes, not in isolation, but in context to a big vision that people could see the hope in. Likewise, if a new highway, which the current Senate President of Florida is proposing, the highway to nowhere again, like you could position that highway against the green infrastructure and what it could potentially do to things. So, this Panther, it needs us to be more creative and find ways to, I can get people's attention with the pictures, but where are we going to steer people, and how are we going to collaborate to design a future that has room for them and for us? Thank you.